Right, it's time to talk about a topic that, for whatever reason, trips students up on the EOC, and that topic is the topic of sexual versus asexual reproduction. So reproduction, obviously, is where organisms make new organisms, and there's two ways that that occurs in nature. The first is the one that probably you all are the most familiar with, and that's sexual reproduction. Now, sexual reproduction involves an exchange or a new combination of DNA from two organisms. We even sometimes call that genetic recombination. All right, so this is a genetic recombination. But the key here is you have two organisms involved with sexual reproduction. Now, you know, the new combination, that's what you get with human sexual reproduction, where, you know, a sperm and an egg come together and combine and form a cell that has a half from mom and a half from dad of the DNA. Not all organisms that reproduce sexually do that. Sometimes what they do is simply exchange pieces of DNA and then divide after that, and that's still considered to be sexual because the cell that results when they exchange pieces of DNA has this genetic recombination. Asexual, this is going to involve no exchange or recombination of DNA, and in other words, you're only having one organism here. One organism copies itself or its cells. That's a form of asexual reproduction, as well as when you copy your cells. So if it's just one organism doing it alone, then it's asexual reproduction. If it's two organisms exchanging or recombining their DNA, then it's considered to be sexual. So this is more of a cloning or a copying process. Now, something to keep in mind. In the cells of each organism, for example, in your cells, half of your DNA or your chromosomes came from your mom, and the other half came from your dad back at the original fertilization that occurred to make the organism, that occurred to make you. However, that DNA is now all your DNA. Even though it's half in common with your mom, half in common with your dad, it's all your DNA at this point. All right, so look at this. Let's take a look at some scenarios together. We're going to start with the cell cycle and mitosis, and you're well familiar with that. This is just a quick summary down here of what happens in the cell cycle and mitosis. You start with one parent cell, right? The DNA replicates, it divides into two cells. Okay, so in this case, cells are copied or cloned. You can consider it to be either. So this is making body cells. And cells are copied or cloned. Is this sexual? Well, is anybody helping you right now regenerate your body tissues? And when you stop to think about that, the answer is no, of course not. Your body cells are doing this by themselves. You have one original organism, this cell, right, from an original organism, and it's copying itself, so it's by itself. So the answer is no. This is not a sexual process. All right, let's look at another kind of division. We're about to learn about this kind of division in the next couple of days here. In this case, what we're talking about is a new kind of cell division called meiosis. So not mitosis, meiosis. This makes gametes. Gametes are also sometimes called sex cells. That's the sperm and the egg, right? This is meiosis down here, okay? Now look at this process. You start with a parent cell. It goes through DNA replication, but this time, unlike mitosis, you're going to go through two cell divisions, and you're going to end up with 4 baby cells here. Now these baby cells are not identical to the original, okay, but they are coming from one parent organism. All right, one parent organism or one parent cell. Now again, bear in mind, I realize that this original cell had half DNA from mom and half DNA back at fertilization that created it, right, like inside of your body, but this is now 100% your cell. Okay, so this is still going on inside of one organism. So in this case, is this sexual? And the answer is no. Okay, and that surprises a lot of students. This is not a sexual process because no one is helping you to make your sperm and egg. Your sperm and egg is just made on its own inside of your own body. Now, is it required for sexual reproduction? And the answer there is yes. In order to have sexual reproduction, you have to do this process. You have to make the sperm and egg. And so it's required for sexual reproduction, but the process itself is not sexual. Now, with that in mind, is there such a thing as recombination in meiosis? And the answer here is yes. In prophase 1, and we'll get into what these phases are in another lesson. In prophase 1, you have an event called crossing over. Okay, crossing over. And crossing over involves paired chromosomes, which is what you're seeing here. And I did one in blue and one in yellow, so you can kind of see the different color there. Okay, this is called a tetrad, which is written in your notes, a tetrad. Okay, that's a tetrad because you have 4 chromatids, right, from 2 chromosomes. And what you'll notice is their arms right here overlap. And where they overlap, that's the crossover. And what happens is the DNA gets so tangled here that this breaks at this point. The crossover breaks at this point. And what ends up happening is you get this. You get a piece of this yellow chromosome breaking off and ending up on the blue, and a piece of the blue chromosome breaking off and ending up on the yellow. Is this from 2 different organisms? No. Okay, it's still happening inside of this cell right here. Okay, so crossing over is happening inside of one cell, so it's still not technically sexual, but what you are doing is mixing up or recombining the DNA here, and this is going to happen in prophase 1. So remember this because we're going to get to this in mitosis. All right, the last thing we're going to look at here is fertilization. Okay, so this is the last kind of reproduction. So this is what fertilization looks like, right? We've got an egg, we've got sperm, and then we put those together to make a cell that has the genes from both the egg and the sperm in it. Is that a sexual process? And the answer here is yes. And the reason why the answer is yes is because the egg had to come from a female, right? So here's our female. We'll give her some hair. Okay. The egg came from the female. This sperm had to come from a male, right? Okay. So this is 2 different organisms involved in this process, a female and a male, and they're fusing their cells together to make one cell. That is sexual reproduction, because we're taking the DNA from mom and the DNA from dad and we're putting it together to make DNA pairs. So here's where I think you guys get tripped up on the EOC, because it's kind of surprising. I know this whole presentation you're probably sitting here going, well, yeah, of course, this makes a lot of sense. There might be a couple of things that surprised you, but mostly, you know, this isn't a big surprise. And I think the problem is when they show this on the EOC, they don't show this with a sperm cell and an egg cell. They'll show you a picture like this one that you see here. All right, so what's happening in this diagram is you've got a male flower, and it's producing pollen right here. Okay, now pollen equals sperm. I know that's disturbing for some of you, but pollen is actually the sperm of the plant, okay? So what's happening here is you've got bees and you've got butterflies and you've got all these bugs that are flying along, they land on the plant, and pollen brushes off on them, and then they carry that pollen to the female parts of the next plant, and they deposit the pollen right here. The pollen is then kind of grows down here and fertilizes the eggs at the base of the plant. Alright, so I've used a couple buzzwords here that should cue you into what kind of reproduction we're talking about. First of all, we've got sperm, right? Second of all, I've mentioned that there are eggs down here. Third of all, I've said the word fertilization. Obviously, this is sexual reproduction. It's just how plants accomplish sexual reproduction. Okay? So this is a sexual process. And like I said, I just think you don't think of plants as having a sexual process, but they do. All right. Up here, you've got a different process. Here's bacteria. They're going through a process known as binary fission. All right, binary fission is their form of mitosis. Okay, so binary fission, that's plant reproduction. Or excuse me, bacterial reproduction. So it starts with one bacteria, and notice it just kind of splits into two separate daughter bacteria. Okay. Now obviously we're starting with one cell, it's splitting into two cells, and these two cells are identical. So this looks a lot like cloning, right? This is a cloning process. This starts with one organism. There's not two organisms involved like in fertilization. There's just one. So this one is obviously asexual. Reproduction. All right, so I think that's what kind of trips students up on the EOC. Last thing I just want to do for you before we go into our last thing is talk about chromosome number. There are two terms that come up with chromosome number, diploid and haploid. Diploid is always abbreviated using this 2N, and that's because chromosomes are paired. So the cell here that is diploid is this one right here. Okay, that's a diploid cell. Okay, the one where what you can see is you've got pairs of chromosomes. This is a pair of chromosomes. And so that's a full set of chromosomes. The other kind of cell is the haploid cell, and haploid cells have half of the chromosomes, so hopefully you hear the word half in haploid. And so these are not paired chromosomes. They typically only contain one chromosome of each kind instead of two chromosomes of each kind. So sperm and egg are example of haploid cells. All right, that'll set us up for the next lesson when we get into meiosis.